The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is Melissa Miller, and I'm a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and also a science communicator.
And I'm your other co-host, James Floyd. I also am a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and StarWars.com. Today on Star Warsologies, we're going to chat about military history as represented in Star Wars by looking at the battles and wars of Star Wars. Our guest expert today is Andrew Liptak, who is a writer and historian and also troops in the New England garrison of the 501st Legion. Welcome, Andrew.
Very glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself as a writer and a historian.
I've been a Star Wars fan for decades. I went to school for history at Norwich University in Vermont, where I currently live. I studied history, focused on World War II for my final paper. And then after graduating, I went and I worked for Norwich University and got my master's degree in military history from the school. The school is the country's first private military academy. And while I was a civilian there's a heavy focus on military history. And my topic of study was to look at what the Norwich University alums had done during the First and Second World Wars. I went and wrote about science fiction history and sort of fell sideways into science fiction journalism. And that's sort of where I am today.
All right. So what encompasses military history? Obviously, people think about, individual battles or overall war, but, what else fits under that category?
It's a pretty broad field, and there's certainly a lot of discussion within the field as to what the character is. There's sort of a perception that it's all like guns and glory. There's no end to topics that you can study with any major conflict, especially once you start to drill down. I've found it to be more interesting when you sort of go beyond just the day-to-day combat, this happened at this battle and this happened at this battle. When you look into strategy, or if you look into studying logistics, or why did things happen? What are the things that underpin human conflict? It covers a lot of stuff. You can research and write about race and gender studies. There's a whole sort of subset to the field of that. How did soldiers of color, how are they treated by their white counterparts? Or how did women become integrated into the U.S. military? Or how does that compare to other militaries around the world? There's ancient military historians who study, Roman and Greek and ancient Chinese wars. There are historians who are commentating on the current wars and looking to understand why we're fighting in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, or maybe as of this recording, Ukraine. So it covers a lot. There's a lot of dimensions to it.
Yeah, and a lot of ways that overlaps with Star Wars that I can already think of. So I'm curious what your relationship is with Star Wars when you got into it, and if it was young enough that it actually influenced your field of study at all.
I wouldn't say it really influenced my field of study, but I got interested in Star Wars when the special editions came out in 1997. I was in middle school at the time. I'd always been interested in history to some extent. My family went to Civil War battlefields. It was when I was in college, that's when I really sort of understood hey, I understand this, and this is something I really enjoy doing. And that sort of made me understand that you can use this field of study to study leadership, to study how individual actions can make a bigger impact, and how an individual's character or training or just where they are can change the course of history. One person in particular that I studied, a guy named Ernest Harmon, who was a major general who was in charge of the 2nd Armored Division during World War II. He went up through the ranks in the U.S. Army, fought in World War II, fought in Africa, and then later fought in Europe. And when the Battle of the Bulge rolled around in late 1944, he was in charge of an armored division, which is thousands of men and vehicles. He was basically told, you have to get all of your guys from one point, 50 miles back behind the lines, in the middle of the night, icy roads, snowstorm. And he was able to, effectively lead all of his people. And then what was really interesting is that during the battle, he was basically told, you hang out, wait for the enemy to come to you. And he was not, let's say, a very patient person. So he's basically sending out patrols here and there. And one of them came back, they'd been shot up. He basically said, all right, well, that's our contact. We're going to go, we know where the enemy is and we're going to engage. Even though those weren't quite his orders, The whole point of that story is that it's the type of person that he was, is that he was able to understand not what his orders were, but what's the purpose of me being here. He knew how to act, and he knew exactly what needed to be done in order to get through the day and to basically solve the overarching problem of a German army bearing down on him. They were able to stop him and push him back, and that's one small action in the much larger story of the Western Front.
I'm having real Last Jedi vibes from this story. This story.
How so?
I was thinking about what makes General Leia Organa a good leader then? And, I'm just thinking of that whole part where they're slowly moving away, and that whole conflict in Last Jedi with Leia trying to train Poe, make him step up and be a good leader. It's something I never really thought of from a leadership perspective.
Yeah. And that's an interesting movie. The thing with warfare that I found is it's so multifaceted. A leader might have a larger strategy that they're paying attention to, whereas if you were on a battlefield, you likely won't see that full picture. You'll see the action that needs to be done right in front of you, and not realize that, hey, every single advance or every single movement that you make is not necessarily forward movement for everything else. There might be a point to what you're doing. And I think that sort of applies for The Last Jedi. I don't know that a battle is a good time for a life lesson, but it is a really good point about leadership that I think Leia was making, is that you can't just go out and fight, and you should take advantage of opportunities when they arise. But there's also a point to strategy, and there's a point to thinking through your actions.
Right. No, and I feel like it's really, I guess, Admiral Holdo in that regard in terms of the big picture stuff, whereas Poe is very much the we're here, we've got this chance, let's blow them to smithereens, and just sort of trying to reconcile that hothead sort of immediate action versus wait, see the whole big picture. That leads to a lot of conflict in that movie, whether or not you like it as a plot point or not.
It's worth noting that, what makes for good entertainment is not necessarily good history. That said, I think that, Star Wars does draw on military history quite a bit. There's good points and there's bad points. It all comes down to particular creative vision of whoever's in charge of it. Rogue One, I thought, did a pretty good job. I think is a much better example of taking advantage of an opportunity that presents itself when Jyn Erso and everybody basically gathers up all the gear that's not strapped down and heads off to steal the plans. The thing that I really like is that once the rest of the Rebel fleet realizes that they've been committed, whether they wanted to be committed to that fight or not, they are able to sort of press that advantage by sending the fleet in over Scarif. As we see, they are able to get the plans out and escape. Although, they have some troubles along the way.
I mean, in that everybody dies.
So that's one good example. Yeah.
You mentioned, that there's a lot of real world conflicts that are both good and bad examples for how things are put into Star Wars. So what are some of those aspects that get pulled from real world conflicts?
There's two ways to look at this. The first is, what has Star Wars drawn in from real world history? And the second is, how do real world military strategists and officers and personnel get inspired by something like Star Wars? So if we talk about the first one, George Lucas, he had a film diet when he was growing up. He saw a lot of war movies. He was in the sort of post World War II era, so he likely heard about the conflict from relatives or friends or the adults in his life. And when he was constructing Star Wars, he knew how to really make an unambiguous villain by casting the Empire against the imagery of Nazis. That imagery is prevalent throughout the Empire's clothing. You look at the Imperial officer uniforms, they are very close to what German military officers wore. The stormtroopers, there were literally Nazi stormtroopers. There's helmets that match up. The film designers were very cognizant of what did the Axis powers wear, and how can we use that as a way to sort of signal these are the bad guys.
Wait, did the Nazis have actual people called stormtroopers? Sorry, that's not something I knew.
They were sort of an elite force, and that's where the name comes from. And Lucas also pulled in other influences. He was moved by the Vietnam War, and he basically imagined the Empire as sort of this overwhelming technological force versus these scrappy rebels. And that's very much a United States versus the North Vietnamese.
Especially when you look at the Battle of Endor.
I'm sure that was on their minds. And that sort of brings me to the next point is those films came out decades ago, and you have people who have grown up watching them, and some of them join the military, and some of them certainly think about how do these films sort of line up with the real world, and how do you inspire creative military thinking by using the creative arts. There is a sort of a movement going on within the military community called FICINT, which stands for fictional intelligence. It was coined by a guy named August Cole and P.W. Singer. They're two authors. They work within military circles quite a bit. And they write military fiction that is not really designed to be sent off to a magazine or, like Asimov's. It's designed to be created for and read by military personnel by taking these situations and like sort of transposing them a little bit into the future. So like, what are the ramifications of putting an automated intelligence system into the battlefield, like an AI type of system? What are the ramifications? Science fiction is like the perfect medium to explore those possibilities. So they write stories about that. They've got a couple books out. One of them deals with a war between the United States, China, and Russia. They basically put it together by taking all the technological trends of the last, couple decades and extrapolate it a little bit forward. And you get a book that's chillingly realistic. Every now and then you'll see like, oh, this like some sort of new thing that happens that China or Russia does. And it's like, oh, that's right out of this book. So that's one way you can get to think about these sort of ideas, is to use pop culture. And Star Wars is certainly a big influence here. There's a book that I took part in a couple of years ago called Strategy Strikes Back, where a bunch of us in this field basically wrote essays about how do you draw lessons from the battles of Star Wars. Mine, I wrote up an entry about the Battle of Hoth and leadership, and how the Empire's fairly inept leadership caused them to ultimately lose the singular objective that they're trying to do, which was to capture the rebel command.
We always, think of Admiral Ozzel, bringing the fleet in at the wrong point. Were there other mistakes made that also contributed to their failure to capture the rebel leadership?
A lot of my argument came down to the overconfidence of the Imperial commanders on the field. Ozzel sort of dismissed some of the things that he shouldn't have. He came out of hyperspace too early. He didn't really pay attention to what he was doing. He didn't really take the threats and the mission seriously.
Just curious about the similarities that you mentioned briefly with Vietnam and sort of the Battle of Endor. What are some parallels there, and where do the Ewoks fit in?
When the U.S. entered Vietnam, it was just generally not well equipped to dealing. It was not built, and it was in such a way that it could handle a counterinsurgency force. It's sort of a colonial exercise. You have outsiders coming in with a certain way of doing things, expecting to sort of fight in that certain way, and it just doesn't quite work out. So the Empire comes down to Endor, places a garrison down there as not really to conquer the moon, but just sort of to protect the station. But they're just not prepared to fight in an unconventional manner like that the Ewoks are able to do. They were able to take advantage of the weaknesses that the Empire forces had. They're clad in bright white armor. There's a colonial element to this where you sort of assume that we've got superior technology. We can just sort of bulldoze over this and it won't be a problem. And that doesn't usually work. The British Empire sort of tried to do this with the American Revolution. The US tried to do it with Vietnam. We've not had very much luck in Iraq and Afghanistan for all of the same reasons. And, Star Wars is not the best or perfect example for this sort of thing. But, there's similarities, and you can sort of make that connection and have somebody conceptualize, this is why this doesn't work. To go back to Rogue One, I think that's also a really good example of unconventional warfare. The thing that I really liked about that particular battle is when they spread out and basically make it seem like they're a much larger force than they are. Even though it's just a couple of guys with explosives, they were able to sort of distract attention away from and misdirect the Empire's efforts to counter them. And that's what allows Jin and everybody to get through their defenses and steal the plans and send them up into space.
You also mentioned World War I, and we see elements of that in Solo with the trench warfare on Mimban, where Han, recognizes that, wait a minute, we're invading them, that we're not the good guys here. But overall, there's a very World War I vibe of fighting in the trenches in the mud.
Well, I think history is a really good thing to draw from. And I like that Lucasfilm designers were able to do that for that film. It's a good way to signal that this is an entrenched battle that is just not really going well for anybody. There's lessons to be taken, I think, from more modern conflicts as well, is that when you sort of drop in and try to just sort of impose your will through force, it's not always going to be all that successful. You're going to have people who are going to resist.
I definitely feel like those standalone movies, Solo and Rogue One, have given a new dimension of that. It's not just all huge armies facing off, in big open battlefields, that trench warfare you're talking about in Solo. And then also, the spy aspect in Rogue One, the working behind the scenes. I like to see the ones that have done questionable things, for the rebellion. I thought that was a really interesting part of the story. And that's why I'm excited about Andor. If there's other examples of that in Star Wars that I'm just not thinking of, I guess it's just mentioned here and there, but to really see that and to see the people who are, making that choice to work a little bit more gritty for the rebellion.
The Wraith Squadron novels, like that's a good example of a sort of a very unconventional force. Rogue Squadron is sort of the same thing.
The newer books, Alphabet Squadron, again, is that type of unit.
Karen Travis's Republic Commando novels are another really good example of the clone commandos are fighting as sort of specialized units in a very unconventional way.
Yeah, I really enjoyed those books. And it made you feel a lot for the clones. One of the things with the clones in the Clone Wars is that they're completely disconnected from overall society, that they don't have a home planet that they're really fighting for the way that conscripts are. What do you think about the home front in like the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War? Do these conflicts really matter to just regular citizens?
That's a really good question. This is sort of an ongoing argument about the nature of war, within the military history field. And it's like, what's the special sauce that makes an American force effective on the battlefield? The idea that, because we're coming from a democratic society, we are inherently better at this sort of thing. As opposed to somewhere like Nazi Germany, where an overly fascist society where you're really disconnected from having a voice in your way of life or your government. There are people who've made those arguments. I don't necessarily agree with them all that much, but I do think that Star Wars does make a really good argument here. Maybe less so for a character as a real world military thing, but more as a character story, is that you have this entire race of people who are basically enslaved and they're fighting on behalf of the Republic. There's the science fictional element here where they are conditioned from birth to do that. There are a couple of examples where you have the clones sort of step out of the ranks and say, like, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. Rex is a really interesting character in this way because he was very much a steadfast loyalist until like much, much later in the series. The Darkness on Umbara episodes really stand out because of that, because you sort of see him starting to question those orders. I think that humanizing the clones is a really great storyline. You saw some glimpse of that also in the sequel trilogy with Finn. It's one of the storylines that they never really followed up on in the films that I hope that they'll get to. The stormtroopers that rebelled. I think that there's a lot to be said for the type of stories. I don't know that it necessarily means any, that there's sort of some intrinsic thing about loyalty or nationalism that gets played at there. More, I think I see it more as a character story. I wrote a little bit about this a couple of years ago for Polygon. Just the idea that humanizing the clones is something that was really, I think was probably one of the better parts of the sort of the whole prequel era.
So we talk about the clones as, becoming individual, and that's the great thing about the Clone Wars. Something that we also see a little bit in the Clone Wars is battle droids kind of a little bit as individuals. Most of the time it's played up for laughs, but every now and then you get this sense of like when one of the, R2 leads a squad and at the end, one of the droids says, "It's been an honor serving you." It's like, where does a droid get the concept of honor?
My take on this is Star Wars has never really been great at depicting artificial intelligence. The robots are characters, and they sort of have their own level of agency. And that's sort of why I've always found the battle droids to be really jarring, because when you play them up for laughs, or when you start to think about sort of how their ranks are or how they are programmed, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because they're supposed to be automated. And I think it's a really good argument for not automating your soldiers. You can think on your feet and not be guided by pre-programming. Instead, they just sort of make them idiots.
Well, I have a theory about that why battle droids suck is because the Neomodians are at heart cowards. They don't want to make a force that could overthrow them or rebel against them. And so they'd like, we're going to make a bunch of robots that A, we can control, and B, if they get out of hand, we can shut them off, or we can realize, oh, hey, their aim is really bad. So we have a better chance of withstanding a droid revolt. Yeah,
but then you don't have a very good military to begin with. And then you're
disposable.
Disposable, there's still resources. And if you build an army, you're not putting it out there for last, you're putting it out there to win. The bigger thing with the robots is that the droids is that they are easy to reproduce. You can overwhelm your enemy pretty easily with them. I think the Phantom Menace probably had the best portrayal of the battle droids.
Earlier, when you were talking about the different fields to study in military history, I was thinking about in the sequels, the female X-Wing pilots, they show people of color and different races besides humans, piloting some of those rebel craft. I mean, that's obviously just sort of a factor of when the movies were made, I feel like, and not a commentary on, the rebel fleet has progressed. And there was a little bit of that in Rogue One, sort of retconning, right? Like, I think it was everyone who died in Rogue One was the women and people of color, so that it made sense, quote unquote, for A New Hope to have just a bunch of white dudes flying their X-Wings, which, isn't great. I don't actually have a question here, I guess. It's just something I certainly noticed, when I saw X-Wing pilots that were women, and thinking about if I'd had those action figures, back in the 80s, not just Leia in all of her different outfits.
It's really interesting to see. Films are a reflection of the culture they come out of, right? So when you have a military story coming out in the 1970s, who are the people who are predominantly in the military, who you think of in the military? Mostly white men. So, that's what you're going to see. And nowadays, the U.S. military has opened up combat roles to women. The best description I've heard of the military is that they are a slice of the country, and they represent a broad swath of who we are. So you have people of all ethnicities, all gender identities represented in those ranks, which wasn't the case back in the 70s. So when you're putting together a film about a nominal military force into the 2000s, you're going to see those updates. There's a lot of sort of give and take when it comes to like how designers are reimagining or imagining what soldiers might look like. I wrote a piece for Polygon about the Halo franchise and how real world military influences were creeping into the game. With each successive installment. The original Halo came out 21 years ago, and it's basically the same age as the War on Terror. The first game's production predated 9/11. The influences you see are from things like Star Wars. They're from things like Aliens, Starship Troopers, and it's basically a very science fiction-y looking game. As you move forward, Halo 2, Halo 3, Halo Reach, we're also engaged in this protracted war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when you're building a game about the military, you want to get the military parts right. So you look at the uniforms, like what are soldiers wearing nowadays? What types of weapons are they carrying? And as the series progresses, you see these changes sort of crop up in the Halo franchise. And you see this in Star Wars too. The Death Troopers, they have chest rigs that have ammunition pouches on them. The First Order troopers, they have, the same thing, and they've got backpacks and stuff, and they look a little bit more tactical. I'm sure that we will see other little advances here and there as the series progresses and as concept art designers look to the real world military for inspiration. So there's all sorts of things that sort of trickle back over in that direction too.
Well, it always helps to make new variations on stormtroopers because that means you can sell more toys.
Over the course of the pandemic, I fell into collecting Black Series figures, and I have an entire bookshelf full that does the entire progression of Attack of the Clones all the way to the First Order of how that armor changes. And every time I see a new stormtrooper, like the last season of The Mandalorian, there was the mortar trooper. They're going to make one of, I've got him on my wall now.
well, going back to the troopers and armor, as someone who studied battles in armor, and then somebody who actually costumes in the 501st, how effective and useful do you think stormtrooper, clone trooper armor would be?
In the real world, not very much. It's sort of a complicated answer. Like stormtrooper armor, they're very famously not great because, they're always missing. You can't see in the helmets and whatnot. But that armor sort of serves a purpose. Like, it's a faceless enemy that looks a little bit like a skeleton. If you see a group of them running around town, that's not great. So I think that there's an element of shock and awe that is sort of the intent behind the armor. And it sort of comes down to like, what types of things are they going to be doing to fight? As we saw in The Return of the Jedi, they're not really well equipped to fight in the forest. But, scout troopers, they can make their way through trees pretty well, and they're not distracted and flying into trees. We saw specialized clone troopers that had camouflage armor. There's all sorts of variations for the different types of environments that they're in. And that extends back to like sand troopers. Like, they're designed to operate in desert environments, or there's the range troopers with their big boots that are sort of designed to operate in really cold temperatures, snow troopers and whatnot. You have to sort of think about, like, what are they supposed to be doing? The stormtroopers on the Death Star, they don't really need to hide. They've got a lot of numbers on their side. As far as like mobility goes, they're a little bit harder to move around in, and you can't really pick one and say, like, all right, this is how they'll be in the real world, because clearly they didn't design it to really operate in the real world just to look cool. That said, the armor does change over time, like the shoretrooper from Rogue One. That's probably my favorite set of armor because it is extremely comfortable. It actually makes sense as a sort of Marine type soldier. I don't feel really constricted while I'm walking around in it.
Can you sit down in that one?
I can, because there's no thigh armor. It's not really restricting your movement anyways. The clones are fairly restrictive because they have the knee pads and the elbow pads. And also sometimes this comes down to personal fit of your costume, but like the short troopers, like they're that to me makes a lot of sense as a type of armor. It protects the chest, it protects your abs, keeps your knees from running into fallen trees or whatever. I can see fairly well in the helmet. But that being said, I wouldn't field a suit of stormtrooper armor in a modern day conflict because it wouldn't work that well.
So if someone is interested in getting into your field, either, military historian or the writing aspect, how would you recommend they go about doing that?
I'm not a really good person to ask about how to get into writing because I have had a weird career there. I went to college for history. I went to Norwich University and I got my master's degree through their graduate school there. I had to get that because it was a job requirement. And I sort of fell into academia that way. And I basically studied history. I wrote papers, and I sort of started writing history stuff because I met an editor of a magazine, and he gave me his card and told me to pitch him some ideas. So I did, and he accepted one of them, and I wrote an article, and they paid me money, and I wrote another one, and I did a handful of those about a whole bunch of different topics. I was also writing about science fiction books and reviewing books, and I ended up sort of falling into the science fiction fandom that way. I wrote for places like SF Signal and IO9 as a freelancer for years, and then ended up working for IO9, and then went over to The Verge, and then left. I taught college journalism for a little bit. I wrote a book. It's been sort of a weird career just of writing for different places and placing pieces here and there. And if I had any bit of advice for if you wanted to become a writer or to start studying history, is if you want to go to academia, go to school for it. And then writing about science fiction fantasy is just write, if you start a blog or pitch an editor somewhere and just keep doing it. And it seems to work.
That's my advice for freelance or, for writing too, is from the freelance perspective. So that's that.
Yeah. Soon you build up a portfolio and you might get new ideas or projects might come your way, or that's just how it works. That's how I've come across some of the more interesting things I've written. Is I've had people sort of see what I've written and get in touch and say like, hey, do you want to write for us? So sure.
Where can people find you on social media? Do you have any upcoming publications? I know you do. Tell us about that stuff.
You can follow me on Twitter at Andrew Liptak, and I write a newsletter called Transfer Orbit. It's hosted at Ghost. It's transfer-orbit.ghost.io. I'm trying to pull back from Twitter and Facebook and just sort of use that as a way to write about science fiction fantasy. So I do book reviews, a monthly list about what books are coming out, commentary about what's going on in the science fiction world, things like that. Upcoming publications, I have a book coming out in June called Cosplay: A History, and it's a fairly robust history of the whole cosplay movement from early days in the 1800s all the way up to the present day. And it looks at things like the 501st. It looks at the rise of conventions, 3D printing, social media, everything in between. And that's coming out from Simon & Schuster's Saga Press, June 28th.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. I really appreciated you coming and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Andrew Liptak, and we want to thank all of you for listening. If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's Star Wars OLOGIES @gmail.com. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service.
No topic is off limits, even the taxation of trade routes and outlying systems, which it sounds like we might actually get to soon. We are part of the Skywalking Network. You can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, Marvel. including Talking Apes, the Max FX podcast, Resilience Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a new YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.